If all this talk of sexuation sounds rather familiar, it's because it is. The JA and the JP with the little a between them in Lacan's new diagram of the Borromean knot, this is all essentially a reformulation of what he means by sexuation and what we've been diagramming ever since our series on Seminar 20. Let's go through them each, one at a time, one more time. JA equals corporal enjoyment, beyond language, sexuated feminine, and well captured in Lacan's formula of feminine enjoyment that reads, not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. How about that JP? Here is phallic enjoyment, beyond representations of the body as one. And this could be the link that helps us understand why JP is external to the imaginary, external to that core, meaning body, that Lacan was talking about. Now, this core, again, is not the body that is life. This is not the animal body, the body of the plant and all that. This core that he puts in the imaginary, as you'll recall, is about the image of the body. Our bodies in particular, the specular images of the human form. And this kind of gets me wondering here. If phallic enjoyment is fundamentally about fragmenting others' bodies, reducing partners to parts, maybe the idea is that this JP is external to imaginations of the body as one. It's a really interesting part in this third Rome discourse. Lacan says that we are introduced to the one through the image of our own body. And our own body is the basis for any understanding of the universe as things turned into one. Oneness as we see it in the world starts with an experience of the specular image of our own body as one, a whole image, something along these lines. So it's kind of got me wondering here if this JP being external to the imaginary is there because it is beyond representations of the body as one. Here, nevertheless, however this turns out, we have individuals, sexed, masculine. And again, well captured in Lacan's formulas for masculine enjoyment, which read, all of his enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And for this reason, he can't stop. He won't stop dreaming about becoming ungovernable. And what do we see between this JA and this JP again? Well, it's that little a. You know, that little a that's been with us from the start of things. What do we see in this little a relative to the JA and the JP in this diagram? Between corporal and phallic enjoyment, we see the masculine subject's surplus enjoyment of the feminine subject's bodily fragmentation. You want it in a nutshell, that's it. That little a, for purposes of sexuation, show the masculine subject's phallic enjoyment moving into an experience more particular of surplus enjoyment, the surplus enjoyment of her body reduced to parts, namely bodily fragmentation. Again, note, if the core here has to do with the imagination of one's body as a singular whole entity, it's no coincidence, it would seem to me, that masculine phallicized enjoyment is moving not at the level of a partner who is whole, but a partner who is fragmented, who is particular, who has been parted out. Namely, a partner who has been reduced to a pile of parts that the masculine subject hopes will allow him to feel whole. Let me be clear one more time with this. She becomes his petita, a little pile of commodities. Which is also, I think this is the crucial part, what makes for their non-rapport, for the fact that there is not and can never be a unifying sexual relationship between them. This is in part why Lacan says that they are parasexuated. You might not have noticed this in your first reading of this third Rome discourse, but it's a pretty clever move that he makes. He says they're parasexuated. But notice, they're not even alongside each other, which is how he toys with the Greek prefix para, which means alongside. But it can also mean against. Parabalian is to throw against, like a parabolic arc, which would be the arc of a missile of some kind. It can mean to throw against, parabalian. So para doesn't just mean alongside, it means against, which is smart here if you think about it. If they're parasexuated, it means that they are sexuated not just alongside, but against each other. The masculine subject is parasexuated relative to the feminine subject. Phallic enjoyment is a parasexuation that is fundamentally against corporal enjoyment. So para here is doing some work that it might be worth us fucking with a little bit. But note this. Yes, masculine subjects in a state of phallic enjoyment are parasexuated. Next to, alongside, against feminine subjects in a state of corporal enjoyment. But they're not even really alongside each other. There's something in between them. A little Jesus between us. I'm sorry, did I say Jesus? I meant a little phallus between us. That little a is what they are in fact next to, if you think about it. Just look at the diagram on your screen. This non-rapport between masculine subjects in states of phallic enjoyment and feminine subjects in states of corporal enjoyment, the non-rapport here is not equivalent to the real. But it does bring us to its threshold. Close enough to the real for all involved to sense in that ab-sex sense we've discussed. To sense what? That we'll never truly reach the real. I think this is what Lacan meant in the press conference that preceded his third Rome discourse, when he said, "For the speaking being, sexuality is hopeless." Let me remind you of this full passage. I don't even know, have you read this press conference? It's pretty cool. It's a couple days before he delivers this lecture, and he's got some pretty nice moves in there. Don't worry if you don't have the text in front of you. I've got it right here, and I want to read for you this section that culminates in his statement that the speaking being experiences sexuality as hopeless. Listen up. But as far as we are concerned, we never truly reach this real. The real, or if you will, the true real. Because as far as we are concerned, we are totally separated from it by reason of a very specific thing whose end I for one believe, although I have never been able to absolutely prove it, we shall never reach. We shall never reach the end of the relation between the speaking beings we sexuate with male and those speaking beings we sexuate with woman. In this domain, we are radically up the creek without a paddle. This is what really designates what is generally known as human being. On this issue, there is absolutely no chance of there ever being a success, by which I mean that we will never work out a formula for it, a thing that is written scientifically. This is why all these symptoms then start to multiply, because everything hinges on this issue. This is why Freud was right to refer to what he called sexuality. Let's put it like this: for the speaking being, sexuality is hopeless. Which suggests to me a clear, coherent, and accessible way to read Lacan's third register, the real, as presented here in his updated drawing of the Borromean knot. The intersectional zones established by its interventions in the symbolic and the imaginary, the ones labeled J phi little a and JA, I think they form a wall of sexuation, constitutive of human being, beyond which we are powerless to reach. So I told you early on that in order for the Borromean knot to work, you got to have all three registers firing at once. Like braided hair, if you remove one strand, the braid falls apart. The same is true here. The real is always already there in the mix with the imaginary and the symbolic. However, Lacan does have this image of the real in his third Rome discourse as an intervention. The real, in a sense, intervenes in the imaginary and the symbolic. And when the real intervenes in the imaginary and the symbolic, if you can imagine this blue circle of the real pushing into the green of the symbolic and the red of the imaginary, it produces these three formations, here marked JA, little a, and J phi. These are formations of a certain wall, a wall of sexuation, that allow us to touch upon the real. You see, they are all within the remit of the real in the blue ring, but we can't go any further than them. There's a limit there beyond which we are powerless to reach. And I'll mark it yellow here just so we can kind of have it in view. So you can kind of see here that there's this wall of sexuation comprised of corporal enjoyment, surplus enjoyment, and phallic enjoyment that put us in the remit of the real, but do not give us access to the real, this field of life. We are powerless to reach beyond this wall of sexuation. So again, yes, there is no doubt about it. Corporal enjoyment, surplus enjoyment, and phallic enjoyment put us in the field of the real, but none of them gives us access to, allowing us to enter what Lacan here calls the real. In this lecture, I want to take the thought on display here just a step further. Again, just following Lacan's lead. J phi, little a, and JA, I want to suggest that these are all fundamentally symptoms. They are symptoms of our inability to reach the end of the non-rapport between speaking beings sexuated male and female. So each of these three formations, each of these bricks in the wall of sexuation, they are symptomatic. Symptomatic of what? Symptomatic of a real whose imagination and symbolization we experience as impossible. What then can we say about this real? Lacan's got a few riffs from this period, again, reaching back into that press conference as well. He says the real is that which doesn't work, and he repeats this again and again in the fall of 1974. He says it's what's wrong. It's what isn't right. He also tells us that the real in question here is the origin of the symptom. Think about that for a second. In recent series, we've learned that the symptom is what is said, D, as the result of a living, embodied act of saying, dear. An act of saying, in turn, produced by a speaking being, commanded by unconscious truth. Now that may sound like a lot. Bunch of fancy $20 concepts in there. But note, all I'm doing is reading the analytic discourse backwards, from product to other to truth. S1 to /S back to S2. That's all I'm saying here. We've defined the symptom as what is said when a barred subject engages in a lived, embodied act of saying at the behest of an unconscious truth, part of which can be said and known, and part of which cannot be said and known. Note, though, we have also learned that there is no such thing as a whole unconscious truth. Like the sexual rapport, that shit just don't exist. And you might even at this point, just as a footnote, recall that existence is a term that Lacan offers for these types of phenomena. They don't technically exist. They're not out there in the world, but they exist. They subsist outside of the world, if we can put it that way, insisting there from without. The sexual relation as an impossibility makes claims on us. God as an existent makes claims on us. So also does the whole truth. We are goaded, as my man Kenneth Burke put it. We are rotten with perfection. Instead, what do we know about unconscious truth? It's the paradigmatic truth in all of this, that it comes in two parts, and never one part without the other in tow. There's the part of truth that can be said. Here is the knowable unconscious that traditionally we have said commands the symptom. There's also the part of truth, however, that cannot be said. Here we have an unknowable field of unconscious truth. And need I even bring it up at this point? Where two or more have gathered, you know there's going to be more still. At the very minimum, where two have gathered, there is also a third, a differential relation that allows the two to remain distinct. A differential relation that must be there logically and must remain there logically in order for any two to exist as just that, two. This is partly why Lacan, in Seminar 21, raises this differential relation to the status of what I've quoted for you earlier as an irremediable division. A division, in other words, whose mediation is impossible. So you've often heard from me that in Lacan's early thought, objet a as the cause of desire, it marks the minimum irreducible distance or difference between any two entities that allows them to appear distinct. What Lacan is now doing in his later thought is he's upping the ante for that differential relation. It's no longer just a differential relation, as you might see in the symbolic. Ones and zeros, presences and absences. It's not a dialectical formation we're fucking with here. What he wants to now do is raise that differential relation to the status of an impossibility. It's not just a differential relation, it's an irremediable division or split between, you name it, the two sides of truth, the two parts of feminine subjectivity. The list goes on. It's a division now whose mediation is impossible. like the sexual rapport. That shit is impossible. And it's in encounters with these impossibilities that we touch on the real. It's no longer an understanding of the differential relations that comprise the symbolic. It's about how irremediable division as a third element between any two differential entities puts us in the remit of the real, not the symbolic. We touch on the real when difference becomes impossible. I think it's here, in and as this impossible third, that we touch on the real, effectively arriving at its threshold, at the edge of the utter void that it is, if we can put it this way. So, my friends, yes, the symptom is still commanded by the unconscious. This hasn't changed. But the unconscious, we've been learning ever since L'étourdi, is commanded by the real. A real that constitutes and sustains the unconscious in the form of an irremediable division between its two halves, its two parts, the sum of which doesn't exist, to say nothing of any greater whole. Sorry about you, Aristotle. When Lacan says that the symptom is a manifestation of the real, all I think he's doing here is cutting out the middleman, cutting out the unconscious. The unconscious is still there doing its work, but fundamentally, the origin, the root, the taproot of the symptom is the real. And he's doing this in order to tell us, as he does at the press conference before his third Rome discourse, that the symptom, and I quote him here, is the most real thing there is. Like the real in which it originates, the symptom is that which doesn't work, Lacan tells us. But again, it is not the real itself. Instead, it's what Lacan calls a manifestation of the real. It's a tangible manifestation of an unimaginable real. An unimaginable real that by way of this tangible manifestation, Lacan says, eats into us, eats away at us as living beings. The symptom, as an extension or manifestation of the real, eats away at us. This is the image that Lacan is fucking with in the fall of 1974. So let me ask a question. What part of our lived experience as speaking bodies does the symptom eat away at? Meaning. Here, written on your screen as sens, S-E-N-S. The symptom is a tangible manifestation of an unimaginable real that eats away at meaning. This is what Lacan is up to when he just casually throws out an understanding of the real as, quote, a gluttonous seagull. The real, he says, is a gluttonous seagull that only feeds on meaningful things. This is what he says in an interview more or less from this period, I think just after his third Rome discourse. The real is a gluttonous seagull that only feeds on meaningful things. And I would add, by way of the symptom. This tangible manifestation. And that's just what it is. It's tangible manifestation the symptom, is not too far removed from this gluttonous seagull. And to illustrate it, in our text, he resorts to another image from the world of non-human animals. I call your attention to pages 32 to 35. We're not going to read the whole thing, but it's definitely worth checking out here. I call symptom that which comes from the real. Plain, right there, bottom of page 33, boom. I call symptom that which comes from the real. It presents itself like a little fish, whose voracious beak only closes to sink its teeth into meaning, which results in one of two things. It either makes it proliferate, and things get a little like wonky here, so let me just try and clarify. Meaning into which the symptom sinks its teeth either makes the symptom proliferate, or the symptom, he says, is burst by meaning. So the image here is of a fish that is the symptom, that is feeding on meaning, here written sans in the diagram on your screen. And two things can happen. If the fish fills its belly with meaning, it will grow and proliferate. It could, however, overeat, in which case it would burst and presumably die, thereby no longer being able to populate the earth, or in this case, the sea. You got to hear what he's up to here also from the book of Genesis, which is why in this very same passage, he's talking about Lord knows this and Lord knows that, because he's messing with the idea of going forth and being fruitful and multiplying and replenishing the earth from the book of Genesis. Not that Lacan thinks he's a god or anything. Okay, reading on. I'm on page 34 now if you want to follow along. Otherwise, just tune in here. There was a time, Lacan says, when I put myself about in medical departments. I will not mention them by name here, even though I allude to them in my paper. Due to be published shortly, I will have to skip a bit, trying to explain what a symptom is. I did not put it quite as I would now, but all the same, perhaps it's a Nachtrag. I believe I already knew, even though I hadn't yet come up with the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The meaning of the symptom is not that with which one feeds it for its proliferation or extinction. The meaning of the symptom is the real, insofar as it puts a spoke in the wheel to stop things from working out. And for all the English speakers out there, don't think that what he's talking about is putting a spoke in a wheel, like a bicycle wheel that has spokes in order to work. He's thinking about putting a metal rod or a stick or a spoke, some piece of metal, some piece of wood, something is inserted into the wheel as it's spinning, causing it to stop. And I think if you can imagine a bicycle with a spinning wheel, the spoke in question here is the one that causes that wheel to stop turning. In other words, it forces it to stop working, putting it in a state of disrepair. Hence, the real. It's what's not working. So if the real here is a gluttonous seagull, and the symptom is the beak or mouth of a hungry fish, where again do we see their food, meaning? Take another look, one last look at Lacan's new and improved Borromean diagram on your screen right now. And don't hesitate to look at it a little differently. Don't hesitate to look at this thing a bit awry. Imagine the position of that little a as the opening of a fish's mouth, as it leaps up out of the water to snap at a hovering insect. And what I'm going to do now to help us kind of visualize this is I'm going to put some teeth on this motherfucker. So imagine what's happening here as a fish that is coming to leap out, almost looking like a Pac-Man figure. And I'm drawing some teeth here so you can get a sense of what this might actually look like. And what I'm going to do to kind of like finish it, even though it already looks like a bad bitch piranha, is you can just imagine that the circle of the reel here is just the rest of that fish. So what you can imagine if you're just listening to this is that the space occupied by little a is like a fish's mouth. I'm even going to put an eye on here and a dorsal fin on this thing, just because we're crazy like that. Why the hell not? In fact, let's give it a little Nemo flipper even. The reel is like this fish, and now you can see it. Do you see it in pink? It's leaping out with its mouth open to gobble up sense, meaning. That's what it feeds on. The symptom is the mouth of the fish known as the reel. So you got to kind of stray from the gluttonous seagull imagery, but you kind of get the idea here. At least I hope you do. Meaning. Sens. You've heard me say that it's one part imaginary, one part symbolic, and no part real. Take a look again at this diagram and you will see. Sens, S-E-N-S, meaning. It is exterior to the real. So check this out. J-A, feminine enjoyment, corporal enjoyment, is exterior to the symbolic. And I think you know why. Phallic enjoyment, J-Phi, is exterior to the imaginary. And we're starting to get a sense why, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture. Here I'm reminding you that sens, meaning, is external to the real. It is beyond the real, which is how the real can snap up at it. This sens, meaning, is the insect that the mouth of the real, qua symptom, snaps at, eats into, and sometimes gobbles up entirely. Now, as I look at this piranha Pac-Man outlined in pink motherfucker on your screen, it's tempting as hell just to stop here with the image of little a, or at least its position in the diagram as that of the symptom. Roll with me on this for a second. Between parasexuated subjects, here marked J-Phi and J-A, in what keeps them ever distant, ever apart, and multitudinous instead of one, we certainly see the symptom, arguably the fundamental symptom of human being, namely speech, language use, the phallicization of others and objects alike, an endless series of would-be partners reduced to little piles of parts instead. There is your patita. You know what we also see here, though? And I'm sure you caught this in your reading of La Troisième. We see gadgets. We see devices. We see new communication technologies. Hell, we even see scientific advances. For Lacan, in 1974, it was the television that he had in mind. For us, Here, now, as I record this in the year 2025, it's undoubtedly the smartphone. These gadgets are also symptoms and also marked little a. Symptoms which might just do us in, Lacan warns at the end of his third Rome discourse. Will gadgets, he asks, gain the upper hand? Will we ourselves really come to be animated by gadgets? This seems unlikely to me, I have to say. We will not actually succeed in getting to a point where gadgets are not symptoms. They are for now. It is obvious. It is even certain that one has a car like a fake woman. One absolutely wants it to be a phallus. But it only has a relation to the phallus in that it is a phallus that impedes us from having a relation with something which would be our sexual partner, namely our parasexuated partner. The para, as everyone knows, consists in the fact that each one remains on their own side, and that each one remains to one side, in keeping with the discussion we had of J.A. and J.Phi having this go-between of objet A, this abject little a between them, that makes sure that they are parasexuated not just alongside each other, but also against each other. And one side more aggressively than the other, I would add. I think this is a pretty damn prescient commentary on new communication technologies, especially as we know them in the digital age. And I would bet that some of you watching or listening to this lecture right now might answer the question a little differently. Will gadgets gain the upper hand? Will we ourselves really come to be animated by gadgets? Lacan thinks it's unlikely, or at least he did 50 years ago. Here we are 50 years later, and I'll be damned if there are some of us out there who aren't animated by these gadgets. Especially among those who bring their gadgets to bed. What happens when you bring a phone to bed? It comes to bed as a symptom. As symptoms, these smartphones, these gadgets, these devices, they ensure that each of us remains on our own side of the bed, parasexuated. You on yours, me on mine, and devices in between. Call your side J.Phi. Call mine J.A. I wish, if only. How about vice versa? Call yours J.A. and call mine J.Phi. Maybe that's more fitting. Make no mistake, there's a little piece of shit between us. Lacan's point is that the symptom between us, as a product of that which doesn't work, namely the real, it ensures that our so-called sexual relationships will follow suit, never quite working out. But let's not let this phallus between us take all the blame, however tempting that might be. I think it's phallic jouissance, here marked J.Phi, that fucks us up the most in love and life alike. And I think this is partly why, in the more elaborate Borromean diagram with which Lacan ends his third Rome discourse, he writes symptom on the side of phallic jouissance. Check it out, find this diagram, note where he writes symptom. It's on the side of phallic enjoyment. The symptom may originate in the real, but it finds us in the field of phallic enjoyment, spiked with moments of surplus enjoyment, and it, the symptom, fans out from there like a contagion. Lacan is outspoken on this point in what I believe to be one of the most illuminating passages in his third Rome discourse. It's again towards the end. You'll get there if you haven't already. I just got overly excited last week and read the whole damn thing. Page 79 gives us the good stuff. The symptom, he says, just under the version of this diagram where he shows you where to write it, is an eruption of this anomaly in which phallic jouissance can be said to consist, inasmuch as it spreads itself out there, this fundamental lack that I have qualified as the sexual non-relation opens up. Thankfully, we have psychoanalysis to help with all of this, right? But what exactly does this mean, to help? Psychoanalysis, Lacan explains in his press conference just before this lecture, is very specifically devoted to that which does not work. This is his definition of psychoanalysis in the autumn of 1974. It is a practice very specifically devoted to that which doesn't work, namely the real. And not in order to make it work, even just a bit, but instead to put us to work. As a therapeutic technique, Lacanian psychoanalysis helps us learn how to deal with that which doesn't work. It's about dealing with the real, not overcoming it, whether by way of religion or science, both of which Lacan very clearly says in here only serve to help us ignore it instead. If psychoanalysis doesn't keep its shit together, religion and science will take its place, will take over its remit. And in so doing, they will help us ignore that which doesn't work. Psychoanalysis features that which doesn't work. Science and religion, Lacan says, help us ignore it. How exactly does psychoanalysis of a Lacanian bent as a clinical practice help us pay attention, sit with, and perhaps even love that which doesn't work? By pushing us toward the impossible, and with it, a sustained encounter with what Lacan calls the world as it truly is, namely an imaginary world without meaning. That is the world as it truly is, an imaginary world without meaning. And where, again, do we find meaningless and sheer impossibility behind imaginary worlds, all of which, remember what we learned in television, go by the same name of reality? The real is not reality. Reality is an imaginary world without meaning. Reality is a fantasy. Where do we find meaningless and sheer impossible figures behind this fantasy? You guessed it, in the irremediable division we experience between self and other, alike, in the utter lack of anything like a sexual relationship. Analyst and analysis alike, both are manifestations of the real, and for this reason, Lacan tells us both are symptoms. Which is why I started this series on Lacan's third Rome discourse, where the lecture itself ends. The future of psychoanalysis, Lacan says, in the final flourish of La Troisième, depends on what becomes of the real. In order for psychoanalysis to succeed, it must fail to relieve us of what doesn't work, real and symptom both. Lacan is explicit on this point. Psychoanalysis, he says, must fail. Only when psychoanalysis fails to conceal or repair that which doesn't work in love and life more broadly is it on the right course, Lacan says, and thus capable of growing and multiplying, like a fish that fills its belly without bursting. I just wish God would have said as much in the book of Genesis, but he didn't. Only in failure can we actually replenish the earth.